Okay, hi everyone. So this is just a little tutorial on how to set up a basic Fortran programming environment on your Windows 10 machine, PC or laptop. So there are going to be several steps to this. The first thing we need to do is to install MinGW. So MinGW is a software package that you can use to install some basic files needed to run Fortran. Okay, so now the installer is going to install MinGW, or it's going to install the MinGW setup software on your system, and I'm installing it in the default directory, which is C MinGW. Now this takes about a minute or two, so we'll just let this run through. Okay, so that's finished installing the package. So now we need to tell the installation manager which MinGW routines we want. So we just want a basic setup. So we're going to install just the basic components. We're not going to need the adder, but we will need the Fortran components, and we will need the C++ components. We're not going to need the Objective-C language. Okay, so we've chosen the basic packages that we need. So now we just do apply changes. Okay, so now this takes several minutes to complete. Just let it run through again. Alright, well that took about 5 minutes to complete. That was pretty slow, but that's done now. So that's MinGW installed and all the important Fortran and C++ routines that we need. So all that's happened there is that MinGW has been installed into a folder on the C drive. So if you look in bin, this is where all the important executables that we need are placed. Things like Fortran, there it is. Now Windows doesn't actually know that this folder exists yet, in the sense that other software won't be able to find it. So we need to place MinGW in our environment, in our path environment variable, and we need to do that ourselves because that was a really basic installation software. So we can edit the path environment variable. We can add a new path, which is just going to be that folder that I just showed you that contains all the MinGW files. Alright, so now any software that wants to use those routines will know where to look. So now we're ready to install Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So this is a really very good programming environment. And you can set up all sorts of different types of code editors, and you can program in all sorts of different languages using Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So let's just install that. So just open the installer, accept the agreement, and install. And I'm going to create all these additional things, which would be helpful. Alright, so we're now opening Microsoft Visual Studio Code. So this is the basic look of Visual Studio Code. So down here, if you don't have a terminal already, you want to open a terminal, new terminal. We can add and get rid of terminals here. So just want one. Here we go. These buttons down the side are important. So this is our Explorer. We can turn on and off, where we can find our files. This is how we run the debugger, which I'll show you later. But the first thing we need to do is to make sure that your version of Visual Studio Code has actually got Fortran installed. So if we type into the search box Fortran, so you'll see all sorts of different options for Fortran, and the one I use is Modern Fortran. So if you click on that, as you can see, I've already installed it previously on this system. All you need to do is just click the install button and you'll have Modern Fortran installed. And this is a nice Fortran programming environment within Visual Studio Code. Okay, so now you need to find your files, your Fortran files that you want to compile and run. So here's one I've set up earlier, which I've called cluster MC. So I'm going to show you now some of my own code and how to run that code using Visual Studio Code, and how to set up the debugger to debug your code. So to run the code, I use a batch file. So here is my basic batch file. I just run the batch file, and what it does, this batch file, is it'll run gfortran. So in other words, it'll compile your Fortran code in this folder. So it only looks for files in this folder. I'm using some old Fortran files, so I'm using the legacy option, and I'll want to use the debugger later, so I'm using the debugger option, and I'm using some fairly straightforward optimizing options as well. And then you need to just write out the name of all of the Fortran files that you want to compile that are in your directory here. Okay, and then at the end you'll say the output will be the name of the program that you want to run. So I'm going to call it cluster MC, and that's an executable. And then in the next line I just run this executable. So the first line compiles all of these Fortran files, and the last line runs the code that you've just compiled. So let's just see if that works. It should work because we've installed MinGW. So I'm going to run clustermc.bat. Okay, so first of all it's compiling the Fortran code, and then it will try to run it. And what we should find is it doesn't get very far because there's a problem reading in the input files. That's okay. Anyway, it runs, it compiles and runs fine. Well, let's just open up Monte Carlo. Is our basic, is the sort of entry routine for all of this, the files that I've got here. So my Monte Carlo file, first of all it calls an initializing routine, and then it calls a Monte Carlo simulation routine. And you can see that it's used, this software is very nice, this programming environment is very nice because it's using IntelliSense. So it's writing all the different types of instruction in your code in a different color according to what they are. So I'll just now go into the initialization routine. So you'll see, comments are in green, include files have their own color, and so on. So it's very nicely laid out. That's one of the attractive features of this Visual Studio Code software. Now you might find with your own code, if you've got some old code, or you haven't quite set up the editor correctly, that you might find that you need to change some of the editor settings in order that it can actually read the code properly. So here are lots of editor settings, and one of the most common things you might need to change in order for your code to actually be recognized is the indentation. Particularly if you're using Fortran, different Fortran standards use different indentation standards, and they can be quite confusing. So in my particular case, I've turned off detect indentation, and I'm using tab size 6, and that ensures that the editor can actually make sense of my code. Now the next important thing is to get the debugger working. So what you can do is you can do start debugging, and we're going to choose to use the C++ debugger, and that opens up a batch file which is going to run the debugger for the executable that you've generated. So to make sure it's working with the executable that we've generated, we just need to enter our executable name here, which was MC cluster. No, it was cluster MC. Okay. And we can get rid of the text here for the path. So that's sorted that out, save that. So now when we run the debugger using this button here, it should all work. So we run the debugger by clicking run. Now before you run, you might want to set some breakpoints, and as you see, I've already got a breakpoint set in my initialization Fortran routine, and I've set the breakpoint at this point just when it starts to open the input data file. So now when we run the debugger, it should get as far as that and then stop, which it does. So it's progressed as far as opening the input file, and as you can see, we're watching these variables isim and beta, and as we step through the code, we'll see that those variables become populated. So isim is just about to be read in from the data file. That's now got a value 2, and then later on beta takes on the value 1 from the input file. Okay, it's all working, which is great. So you now have a fully working Fortran programming environment with debugger. We can stop the debugger there.